All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And also presenting today is Jamie Fidel from Vermont Natural Resources Council. Jamie, do you want to just say hi and we'll associate a name with a voice?
Sure, thanks, Jens. Jamie Fidel with Vermont Natural Resources Council. Good to see you all.
Great. If everyone would mute their, make sure the microphones are muted, that would be great. This session is being recorded. We love it when your video is on for the questions at the end and during the middle, but feel free to turn that off while we're presenting if you have any issues with bandwidth or whatever. Today we're going to talk about reviewing your town plan and regulations, and I'm going to do the first half of this talk, thinking about the project history and some of the methodology. And I'll start with just some of the basic town plan review results. And then Jamie's going to take over and talk about the bylaw review and some of the more general observations and recommendations. Before I get too far along, I just want you to know where I'm coming from. I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and the mission of the department is the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. This is a huge mission that takes us into a variety of different types of conservation, from working with species to larger scale projects of like habitats or whole ecosystem conservation across Vermont. That mission also takes us into working with all sorts of different Vermonters, from folks who enjoy hunting, fishing, trapping, wildlife watching, thinking about landowners and future generations. So it's a huge mission, and it takes us into a variety of different types of conservation and constituencies. I work for the Community Wildlife Program, and we serve all Vermont municipalities and regional planning commissions. And on screen, you see some of the free services we offer to towns and commissions. So if you need assistance, please reach out. We'd be happy to help. You'll see my email again at the end of the presentation today. I also just want to say that overwhelmingly it's hunters and anglers that pay for conservation in Vermont, but really anyone can get involved through donations to the Vermont Habitat Stamp or through the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. So please consider that, those options. Okay, so now I'd just like to give a broad overview of land use planning in Vermont. So towns are authorized but not required to prepare and adopt municipal plans. And that town plan is really the visionary document for what the town will look like and what projects the town is going to take on in the next 8 years. The town plan has to be in compliance with the regional plan, and it's the basis for zoning and subdivision. The town plan is required to include 12 elements, and many of those are related to natural resources. And those include a land use map, identifying areas for the maintenance of forest blocks and habitat connectors, a land use plan that includes a map and a statement of present and prospective land uses. To receive the benefits of having a plan approved by the regional commission, the municipal plan must also be consistent with a number of state planning goals, including a broadly stated goal to maintain and improve the quality of air, water, wildlife, forests, and other land resources. So there's a state land use planning framework, and most of the responsibility is given to the municipalities. In Vermont, the planning has been going on for quite a while. It's an iterative and circular process. And the municipal plan module from the Vermont Planning Manual is a really great source of information from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development on the background of planning in Vermont, and gives more detail on this 5-step process of looking at community assessment, developing a shared vision, identifying goals and objectives, mapping out the future, and identifying priority action items. So a little bit more about this project in particular. This is the third iteration of a project designed to assess the overall scope and effectiveness of local planning and land use regulation around wildlife and habitat considerations. As many of you know, the vast majority of development projects are reviewed at the town level and not subject to Act 250 or other state development review processes. So understanding what's happening in this space is critically important to our future. We've done 3 statewide reviews now, one in 2000, one in 2011, and one in 2021. This year includes a complete review of all the town plans, zoning, and subdivision bylaws. For us, this is incredibly important work because it sets the direction for our technical assistance efforts across Vermont. So the first step here is an assessment of what your town situation is. And so let me just show you some screenshots from the Vermont Planning Atlas. And this can be a really useful way of figuring out, well, what's the status of the town if I don't already know? So at left, you see, again, from the Planning Atlas, the town of Hardwick, and you can see some of the village designations. And then at right, you can learn a little bit more about the regulation status and the status of the town plan. So sources like this are a great first step in figuring out where your town is at with respect to land use planning and bylaws and regulations. In terms of, if you think about reviewing your plan, you know, a lot of what we do when we're looking at new plans is just first taking a look at the overall organization. And then I often dive into the natural resource chapter and I'll read that in depth. Then I'll go to the maps. These are often included in the document itself. And sometimes those are totally separate documents that aren't included in the PDF of the town plan itself. Then I'll look at the land use and energy and transportation sections, and then I'll go to the future land use sections. I'm bringing this up because I think it's important that you have a sense of how we approach town plans with respect to this review, and also to give you the skills to approach your own town plan and look for ways to assess that. So the next important piece here is the JAM Golf Vermont Supreme Court decision. And JAM Golf was a 2008 Supreme Court decision that struck down a section of the South Burlington zoning code for being overly vague. Those are my non-lawyer words for it. But the Supreme Court decision speaks to a tension in the town plan of wanting development and wanting resource protection, but not adequately balancing the two. And the decision takes aim at that zoning and says that it wasn't clear enough on what they wanted to protect and what level of protection the town wanted. So I'm bringing this up because it puts us all on notice to be as specific as possible in our planning work and our regulatory work. The other sort of trend that we're seeing across the state is a trend towards brevity in town plans. So we have this Supreme Court decision telling us we need to be as specific as possible about the standards and locations of these things. But we also have this trend of wanting our town plans to be readable and immediately accessible to our townspeople. So I'm just speaking to that tension a little bit. All right, so that's this first section on the overall overview of the town plan of the project and some basics on town planning in Vermont. Are there any questions from the chat, Andy?
Not yet.
Folks, you can feel free to write questions in the chat during the presentations. It would be great to get them in that context. Alice, feel free to unmute your mic.
Yeah, I just have a basic question. We're currently in the work on our land use map. But is there a difference between the land use map and a future land use map? I'm trying to get my head around this process.
We're talking about the future land use map. And that's often, towns often use their zoning in the future land use map, but they're not the same. And so that future land use map is really important and can be different from current regulations. So Dakota, I see, what are you looking for in your review? What do you hope to find? Well, we're trying to assess the overall status of all the town plans with respect to fish and wildlife and those considerations. And so over time, we're looking for how those trends are changing, what's included in the town plans, and get a better sense of the difference between the aspirational language in town plans and what actually shows up in bylaws. And so Jamie's going to speak more to that in his section. Val will provide a link to that Supreme Court decision. There are a variety of different, I usually just Google it and find a variety of different reviews of that decision. And then, or any specific takeaways or recommendations for reviewing and strengthening town plans. Yes, we'll certainly get to those recommendations at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to dive into my next section on some of the basic results of the town plan review, and then Jamie will take over with a little bit more on that and the bylaw and regulation review. But again, feel free to write questions in the chat. That's really the best way to get your questions answered at the next break. Okay, let's start on this next section. Okay. So in terms of methodology, a team of reviewers from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Vermont Law School reviewed an enormous number of documents against this big series of metrics relating to wildlife, habitat, natural resources, and land use planning. In all, we reviewed 235 town plans, 207 sets of bylaws, and 145 subdivision regulations. So in total, this represents the vast majority of municipal planning and regulatory documents that are available statewide. And this is not a perfect picture. It isn't every single town plan. There are all sorts of issues on the books. And so we did the best we could with what had been officially adopted at the time of our review. We believe this offers a thorough representative sample of what's happening in the state. So first piece of results is that as we had a sense, nearly every town has a planning commission. About half of the towns in Vermont have a development review board, and that number has grown in the last 10 years. Just under half of plans reviewed acknowledged their town conservation commission, though the true number of conservation commissions statewide is a little bit above half of all Vermont municipalities. And then 10% of the plans that we reviewed also discussed establishing a conservation commission. So we're hoping to see some more growth there in that metric in the future. 99% of Vermont communities identified some form of habitat in the municipal plan. About 90% of plans include some form of natural resource inventory data, and the inclusion of mapped data has almost doubled since the start of this study, from 52% in 2000 to 95% in 2020. So on screen, you see a map of Newfane, the natural resource map in the town plan for Newfane. And these are the sorts of documents that we reviewed, not only the text of the town plan, but also the maps and what data is included in the maps. So I just want to give you a sense of how incredibly complicated this review is to not only go through text, but also include that mapped data. So 99% of Vermont communities identify some form of habitat in municipal plans. 90% of those plans include some form of natural resource inventory data. And the inclusion of mapped data has almost doubled since the start of this study. So we're seeing incredible progress in terms of inclusion of mapped data. And again, that speaks to that jam golf decision that I spoke to earlier, that need for specificity in where we want to protect these different features. State data, data from the state itself, continues to be a very popular source of inventory information. And local data, things that include natural resource inventories from consultants, also includes, it continues to gain popularity as a data source. We're at about 41%. So this is encouraging in the sense that local inventory data can really offer site-specific information that often can't be replicated with state data. A lot of the state data is based on modeling, and a lot of that local data is based on actual field work. So this is an incredibly encouraging trend to see that added specificity and that importance of local work. So since the last report in 2011, the Vermont legislature passed Act 171 to address forest integrity. And that requires town plans that were passed since January 1st of 2018 to identify forest blocks and habitat connectors and to plan for development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation and to promote the health, viability, and ecological function of forests. So this is a huge addition, important addition, I should say. It's not actually that different from what many Vermont towns have been doing for many years, but it's important in that it raises the bar for planning across all the towns. So Jamie will present some more metrics in terms of how that act has changed what we're seeing in some of the plans and bylaws. This is a graphic that we show a lot in our technical assistance work to towns. And I think I recognize a lot of faces on the webinar, and I know many of you have seen this slide before. But our technical assistance efforts over the last decade by the department and also by VNRC and other entities, including the regional planning commissions, have focused on the importance of maintaining large blocks of core forest and habitat and travel corridors or areas that maintain habitat connectivity. So addressing forest fragmentation, the breaking up of intact forests and habitats, it's become a real priority issue in Vermont. And this study confirms that an increasing number of municipalities are explaining or defining habitat forest fragmentation. They're discussing travel corridors and large forest core habitat. And so we've really made some great gains over the last decade in these concepts. Some of this is attributable to Act 171, and we're going to try and get a better sense of that in this next section. So, so here we can see the growth in those sorts of in those metrics between 2009. That's the 2011 report. The dates just refer to when we did the analysis versus when the report came out. So you can see some of these impressive metrics in how this concept of forest blocks and connectors has been increasingly incorporated in town plans over time. So I spoke about Act 171, and from that's a new part of our analysis. We reviewed the 131 town plans that were in good standing that were required to comply with Act 171. So by that, I mean they were adopted after January 1st, 2018. And so overall, a large percentage of the town plans incorporated elements from the guidance on Act 171. So for example, 76% of town plans included maps of forest blocks, and 66% of plans included maps of habitat connectors. That's really great news. A strong percentage of town plans included policies to minimize forest fragmentation, 83%. And an equal number of plans, 83%, included narratives or definitions of forest blocks and habitat connectors. Again, Jamie's going to talk more about that importance of defining these terms. So the one area where town plans need to improve is describing in greater detail the areas proposed for the maintenance of forest blocks and connectivity areas. It's unclear if municipalities are opting to map these areas without including descriptions. But you can see that compared to some of those higher numbers, those 83% numbers, it's striking how fewer identify those actual areas, or describe those areas, I should say. 91% of town plans recognize the public benefits of habitat. And furthermore, 86% of town plans recognize the importance of public access. For us, this really highlights some of the many listed public benefits of habitat, things like fishing, recreation, hunting, hiking, snowmobiling, wildlife habitat, wetland functions and values, boating, cross-country skiing, swimming. We see this whole list of things that appears in one town plan or another. And these public values demonstrate that habitat is providing a huge range of benefits to the public, ranging from direct experiences in nature to ecosystem services. So there's a lot to say about public benefits and how that has changed, increasingly recognized over the 3 studies we've done. You can see here the growth in those, in the identification of public benefits and in the importance of public access, and how that metric in particular has really skyrocketed over the last 3 iterations of the report. So in our 2010, in our 2011 report, the 2009 data, only 2% of town plans recognize climate change. And so this was a really important aspect of the study, is looking at climate change and landscape resiliency. So the good news is, in this most recent review, approximately a quarter of all the town plans recognize the relevance of natural landscapes in mitigating the effects of climate change. That's 21%. And the relevance of adaptation as a climate change concept. That's 19%. Fewer town plans recognize the importance of maintaining connectivity for species to adapt to climate change. That's only about 16%. So these are new metrics. The only comparable metric that was analyzed in the 2011 report, the 2009 data, is the relevance of climate change as it relates directly to wildlife. And that's that 2% number that I quoted at the beginning of this slide. So these results highlight the need for increased educational efforts, addressing climate change principles as they relate to impacts on our wildlife and natural ecosystems. I think we need to do a better job of connecting the dots between the big concept of climate change and what this means in Vermont with respect to wildlife and wildlife adaptation. 96% of all town plans recommend the utilization of non-regulatory policies. This demonstrating more growth in this strategy for achieving natural resource goals. We assessed a number of other strategies recommended in town plans, such as the use of conservation easements or the enrollment in the current use program. So you can see some of those. You can dig into each of these metrics in the final report. But there's a huge acceptance of non-regulatory strategies in town plans. Again, we can look at some of the finer points here and really dig into those in the report. Okay, so that was the beginning of the town plan review section. Andy, could you tell me about questions in the chat, please?
So we've had some exchange of resources in the chat. Alice notes also that the Waitsfield Planning Commission just finalized its critical forest block and habitat connectors work, a 3-tiered project, I believe. There's no other questions at this point, so if folks have something to say, you can either raise your hand or type it in the chat, and I'd be happy to read it out.
Okay, well, feel free to keep those questions coming in the chat over the course of the presentation. I'm just going to stop presenting and hand it over to Jamie Fidel. All right, Jamie, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jens. Everybody able to see the presentation?
You are all set.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Jens. So I work for Vermont Natural Resources Council. It's really been pride of some of my work to have this collaborative effort with the Fish and Wildlife Department over a couple of decades now. VNRC takes a strong interest in land use planning across the state, and as a nonprofit, we help engage communities with a lot of technical assistance on natural resource planning, and we also compile a lot of data at the state as far as what's happening from a land use perspective. And so I'm going to cover sort of what's happening on the regulatory side, the review of zoning bylaws and subdivision regulations. As you can see here, at least going back to the town plan or municipal plan perspective, there's strong support for regulatory concepts, the implementation of regulatory concepts. So you see here, there's strong support for things like the clustering of development, having siting standards, subdivision regulations. 74% of town plans support the implementation of subdivision regulations. And then you can see the other types of strategies that we took a look at here. And so also when the report comes out, you're going to be able to see the distribution of the support for regulatory strategies. So for example, some areas of the state, there's much stronger support for implementing regulatory, and you also be able to see the non-regulatory strategy support versus other areas of the state where it's not supported to such a high degree. And so this is just a useful way in the report that'll come out to be able to look at the distribution and level of support across the state. So from a land use regulation perspective, the amount of municipalities with zoning regulations has really remained static. So it's essentially the same. There's just sort of a technical clarification in how we actually captured the amount of municipalities with zoning regulations. So we're basically right now at this point considering that 80% roughly of municipalities want to have zoning regulations in the state, and that's leaving 20% of municipalities that are making a fairly deliberate choice not to have them. I mentioned before that there was strong support, 70-something% in the town plan support for subdivision regulations, but actually 55% of municipalities have actually implemented them. So that shows that there can be a lag in the amount of from the aspirations of a town plan to actually then getting the regulations across the finish line. And then we're seeing a lot more municipalities actually combining both subdivision and zoning into what's called a unified bylaw. And so now 40% of municipalities are combining them into one unified set of regulations. So interesting, just tried, there we go. So again, this is just showing you the regional distribution here of towns with zoning. You can see some regions in the state have 100% of their municipalities have zoning, while let's say up in like the Northeast Kingdom, you know, there's a lesser degree of towns that have zoning. So again, when the report comes out, you'll be able to look at the distribution. So we wanted to take a look at what's going on within different zoning districts that are employed. And obviously this report has a heavy emphasis on wildlife and has a heavy emphasis on conservation-oriented districts, natural resource-oriented districts. So we tried to compile metrics based on some of the more popular conservation-oriented districts, such as a conservation district or a forest reserve district. So what this is showing you is the percentage of towns that we reviewed where the district exists. So 44% of the municipality bylaws that we reviewed had a conservation district. 25% of them had a forest reserve district. Then we looked to see if they had specific standards or attention to wildlife review within that district. And so you can see here the percentages 19 and 23%. And then we look to see if the district actually has standards for reviewing habitat or forest fragmentation. And so you can see here, for example, the Forest Reserve District has a stronger attention to reviewing forest fragmentation. We also look, for example, at overlay districts. And they're more specific, to something like, let's say, wildlife corridors, for example. There's going to be an overlay of where they exist in the state, or certain natural resources that would be incorporated in an overlay district. So obviously, much lower percentage of municipalities are employing these, but for those that do, there's a much higher percentage or chance that they're going to address specifically wildlife and address fragmentation or habitat fragmentation in particular. So those are showing us that those are successful districts as far as getting at wildlife and fragmentation review. Then we obviously wanted to look at, well, what's happening in the residential or rural residential districts that are more intensive development. This is where development tends to be happening, appropriately so. That's what they're zoned for. And we wanted to understand, well, are those districts looking at wildlife impacts? Are they considering fragmentation? We know that some of the other conservation-oriented districts clearly are concerned about fragmentation, but we know that it's important if those areas are being developed, they still have important forest resources or wildlife resources. Are they looking at reviewing fragmentation as the development is occurring? And what we found is, in fact, it's a very low percentage that are actually considering wildlife or fragmentation in these districts. So when we get to the observations at the end of recommendations, I'll talk about some of the conclusions we've drawn there and some of the recommendations that we make in regards to trying to boost fragmentation attention, for example, in the zoning districts where we're seeing a lot more development.
Jamie, sorry to interject.
Yes.
Just a quick question from the chat. Could you go to the previous slide and just define specific wildlife review, what that second horizontal line refers to? There was just a question there.
Sure. I actually don't have the appendix, which has the definitions in front of me, but I'm going to. I think basically what that's getting at is whether there are particular standards, development review standards within that district that have a particular attention to wildlife. Okay, so we looked at development and density controls, looking in particular at the use of planned unit development or planned residential development provisions. These are common occurrences in Vermont zoning regulations. They can help protect wildlife and prevent forest fragmentation, require clustering of development, can help guide road and utility layout, and require percentage of land to be set aside as open space. So these oftentimes create incentives for a heightened level of density if there's an offset, a certain amount of open space, for example, that's designated within the PUD or PRD. And interestingly, we saw a dip in the standards, the development review standards within PUDs and PRDs that mention wildlife and that mention natural resources. What we think may be happening is that this may be showing that there's a heightened trend now of utilizing conservation subdesign and addressing those impacts through subdivision regulations, and that those may be driving more of a promotion of open space and cluster development. So this is just an interesting metric to look at. So then we tried to capture what's happening with development review standards. And there's different types of standards that are employed in zoning bylaws. So for example, general use standards more or less apply to most or all types of development. And then it's broken out based on whether you want to have, let's say, a stream buffer applying to development, or you want to have habitat fragmentation standard, a wetland standard, a surface water protection standard that would apply to all development across the zoning bylaw. And what we saw here, and there's a lot going on here in this figure, but I'll try and boil it down for you, that we're seeing that general use standards by and large are being utilized at a higher level compared to 10 years ago when we looked at this. And also that there's an increase in attention to wildlife in these general use standards for those that are being employed. So for example, here, if you look at fragmentation, we saw only 2%, 10 years ago, actually had a general use standard for addressing habitat fragmentation. Now 18% that we reviewed had that. And then there's, 50% of that 18% are actually specifically addressing it because of wildlife concerns. So we're seeing increased attention to the utilization of general use standards as a trend. And then what we did this time around is we actually combined conditional use standards, which basically requires a heightened level of review by, let's say, the Development Review Board for certain uses that may be concerned to have a heightened level of review. And then we also looked at site plan requirements, the layout of how a certain type of development should happen. And we combine those into what we call here development standards. And so these are aggregated at the bottom. And the increase in the use of standards suggests that more municipalities are incorporating natural resources into the regulations for all districts versus regulating by a specific district. And this highlights the evolving role of development standards as a tool. Despite the common use of development standards for addressing natural resources, which is at 52%, at the bottom there, only 1/5 of the standards explicitly mention wildlife. And so while this represents a slight increase from 2009, it shows that natural resources in general are being employed, but there's still a need to sort of address particular attention to wildlife impacts through these development review standards. And then only 8% actually mention habitat fragmentation. So for those municipalities that are doing site plan review or conditional use review, it's important for them to consider boosting the attention to an issue like addressing fragmentation. Okay, then we looked at some additional requirements in the bylaws. So for example, do the bylaws require a wildlife habitat inventory? We saw a spike in that from 7% to 34%. We also saw a lot of growth in requiring an inventory in the initial application. So this is encouraging as far as capturing that upfront review, an inventory, if you will, of what's on the ground in order to understand what the development impacts may be. There was also an increase in requiring consultation with an independent professional. So an ecologist, for example, that may be brought in. We did see a decrease in sort of the required consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Department itself. That may be because some municipalities are concerned about burdening the department. There's also a lot more resources available online now. The agency's been doing a great job of making more and more information available through BioFinder, for example, and it may be that municipalities are relying on that more than asking the Fish and Wildlife Department to actually come out to the municipality to consult on the impacts of a particular project. What's really interesting here is we definitely rang the alarm bell the last time we did this study 10 years ago, that municipalities needed to do a much better job in defining wildlife habitat. And it goes right to the heart of what Jens was talking about before we did the golf decision. If municipalities are not being specific in defining the types of habitat that they want to conserve, then those regulations may be found to be unenforceable because they're too vague. So for example, if a municipality says in their regulations and their zoning bylaws, conserve important wildlife habitat, and they don't define what that habitat is, how will an applicant know? How will the Development Review Board know what is important wildlife habitat? So it's really important to define that. So we did see, hopefully based on some of the technical assistance and outreach efforts over the last 10 years, that there's been a growth to 21% in those municipalities that are actually taking a step at defining wildlife habitat. But it's a deficiency that 79% of municipalities haven't taken that step, and they remain potentially vulnerable if they don't button that up. So then we looked at comprehensively at subdivision regulations as a different level of review. So what I mentioned before is there's strong aspirational support in a municipal or town plan for subdivision regulations. We're seeing, still a lag in the percentage that are being implemented, but there was some growth over the last 10 years from 50% to 55% as far as municipalities that are employing subdivision regulations. What you can see here is the standards within the subdivision regulations then that mention wildlife. There was slight dip there, not too much. And again, a slight dip in the standards that mention wildlife or natural resources in particular. And there's been a dip in the required mapping. So these are interesting trends. There has been an increase when there is required mapping for the mapping that mentions wildlife, that requires, or that has mapping in particular for wildlife resources and natural resources for those. So for those maps that are being employed, they are doing a better job of addressing wildlife and natural resources. Again, subdivision regulations, only 8% 10 years ago actually defined wildlife habitat. We saw similar to the last slide now, 23%. So we're seeing an increase there. That's good. There's still a pretty big gap though. And then for the first time this round, we actually looked at how many subdivision regulations were addressing fragmentation. So interestingly, close to 40% are, which is really encouraging. And so while we're not seeing fragmentation being addressed in development review standards in zoning bylaws, we are seeing more attention to addressing fragmentation through subdivision regulations themselves. And so that's an encouraging trend. So again, when we publish the report, you'll be able to see from a regional perspective where subdivision regulations are being employed, and there can be huge differences based on the region as to whether they're in favor or not. And so again, just another interesting way of looking at the data that we've collected. So I'd like to share some observations now and recommendations, and then we can open this up to some discussion. So in general, what we're seeing is a lot of great planning. Clearly we are making progress on a number of different metrics. Nearly every town has a planning commission. We're seeing an improvement or heightened recognition of the public benefits associated with wildlife habitat in municipal plans. Municipal or town plans strongly recognize the value of both non-regulatory and regulatory strategies. There's not much of a discrepancy there. Both are very popular. And as Jens showed you in the slides, there's a really cool increased number of municipalities that are now identifying forest blocks and travel corridors. That can be in part due to Act 171 and the amount of towns that are actually now implementing those requirements to address and identify forest blocks and travel corridors, and also through the great technical assistance that Jens and Andy do, and other entities in the state, perhaps including VNRC and some of the technical assistance we've been doing as well. Municipalities are seeing the benefit in shaping where development occurs. 74% of municipalities recommend subdivision, for example. Again, we've already talked about this, a lesser degree are actually implementing it. So this is a theme, it's easy to come out in favor of something in a town plan. It can be harder to actually then implement it. And so we need to work on trying to match the intent that's in the town plan within actually the implementation. In general, we're seeing municipalities supporting the use of siting standards and general use standards. As I mentioned before, though, trying to boost the attention within those standards to addressing fragmentation in wildlife is really still a growing and ongoing need. In regards to particular districts, conservation districts are popular. Certain types of conservation districts are more popular than others. Many do mention wildlife, especially the overlay districts. But in general, only 19% of conservation-oriented districts specifically address wildlife impacts, so there's work to do there. And many conservation-related zoning districts lack specific standards to address habitat or forest fragmentation. So we talked about this before. In residential-oriented districts, only 9% of towns mention wildlife, and only 4% of residential districts have fragmentation standards, even though that's where a majority of the residential development occurs. So one of our key recommendations is trying to boost attention to good site plan review to address fragmentation, even in the residential districts. So that's not to say development's not going to occur there. Of course it is. It's just the pattern of how it happens. And should there be a consideration for trying to minimize the fragmentation as that development is occurring in those districts. And again, wildlife overlay and natural resource overlay districts are the strongest in paying particular attention to wildlife and fragmentation impacts, yet it's a small percentage of municipalities that actually implement them in zoning. So some of the recommendations, and we're just going to highlight a couple here, really going to encourage you to look at the report, which will have a much more comprehensive suite of recommendations that you'll be able to read about. Of course, we encourage you to get the help and to use resources that are available, whether that's working with your regional planning commission, working with Andy and Jens, working with a professional planner, reaching out to an NGO like VNRC that helps with technical assistance. Certainly get the help that you need to help you do good conservation planning. Conduct or apply a local inventory. We're seeing increased favor in actually using inventories to guide development review. And then use it both to inform both the planning that happens at the town plan level and regulation and development review. Obviously, we're seeing Act 171 seems to be a really important mechanism for boosting town attention to the importance of forest blocks, habitat connectivity areas. Lots of education's been happening. We should put a premium on continuing to implement Act 171 and helping municipalities in that implementation. For those municipalities that don't have a conservation commission, we're recommending that can be a really important mechanism to help with the overall natural resource planning and implementation that occurs within a town. We didn't really get to hit on this too much before, but we did, in the report we'll highlight this, that there are certain types of habitats that may be more technical in nature, let's say maybe grassland or shrubland, that we will be making recommendations that it would be better for the town plans to address them in particular. And also, as we already highlighted, improving policies to address climate change. So for example, we're going to have a recommendation in a report that there should be really a statewide technical group of land use planners, regional planning commissions, natural resource professionals, climate change experts that come together and say, how can we translate what's happening with climate change and how can we translate those into meaningful policies, implementation steps, town plan recommendations in order to maintain resilient landscape in Vermont in order to withstand the impacts of climate change, especially for wildlife. Be specific about what to protect, include those definitions, be aware of Supreme Court precedent that says if you don't have the specificity you need, you may not have an enforceable regulation at all. So we need to really continue defining with specificity the resources that we want to protect. Again, we've already talked about this, transition to town plan support for regulatory action into meaningful policies, try and correct the gap or the rift that exists right now. And then obviously continue to provide the technical assistance to municipalities to strengthen development review standards, in particular that address wildlife impacts and fragmentation of habitat. So there are resources that are available. There's these publications from the Fish and Wildlife Department that provide a lot of good information and resources for you. We also have our publication at VNRC Community Strategies for Vermont's Forest and Wildlife. It's really a menu of both regulatory and non-regulatory options, implementation options, if you will, for conserving wildlife and forests. And we're actually about to do a reprint of this with some new chapters, including a chapter about Act 171 implementation. And then, of course, there'll be the forthcoming report. And so you're really getting a sneak preview here of what's going to be coming out in a published report that's going to cover a lot more analysis and provide a lot more figures about the metrics that we reviewed through this whole effort. And we anticipate this report to be available hopefully within a month, just a final step of actually kicking it out to peer review with some of our colleagues in the regional planning commissions and some professional planners that have been helping to review our findings so that the report has a really nice level of peer review before it gets published. So with that, I will wrap this up and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm just going to read out a couple questions from the chat, and you and Jens can take them popcorn style. So the first one is Dakota wondering if Alice might be able to share some of the Waitsfield Town Plan as a case study for defining and protecting critical forest blocks, so we can facilitate connecting those of you offline. Alice has a question wondering if relating to affordable housing initiatives, if you're seeing tension or pressure on development versus conservation measures.
Sorry, Andy, just trying to figure out how best to answer that. Maybe can you actually repeat the question just so I understand?
Yeah. So the way I read it, Alice is wondering if we're seeing tension or pressure on development or conservation measures as it relates to affordable housing initiatives. And Alice, if I got that wrong, just come online and correct me.
No, that's you've got it right. What I'm seeing in Waitsfield, or what I'm feeling, because I keep in touch with our housing coalition and affordable housing initiatives and where can we build. I always feel that, you know, and you did the wetlands project, so now we know where we can build in the town center, et cetera, et cetera. And I find that I'm kind of saying, oh, let's slow down here, because we're still working on the town plan. We still need more things in our toolbox to look at that development. But there's like well, let's hurry up and simplify things so we can hurry up and build, versus doing it in a much better planned way. Also looking at the subdivisions with an eye to preventing forest fragmentation. I'm just wondering if Jamie's seeing that at all in these figures.
That's helpful, Alice. I don't think this report is as informative on that point, because it didn't, you know, holistically look at sort of how affordable housing, how housing is sort of being measured across the board. But I can say that I think statewide right now there's a lot of attention and a lot of pressure right now to deal with the housing crisis in Vermont, to build affordable housing, to have enough housing stock for the people who want to live here, and how to balance that and how to create the right incentives statewide for sort of funneling or encouraging development according to our statewide land use planning goals, which is in more concentrated areas, but dealing with the problems where we don't have enough, you know, funding, let's say, for infrastructure, you know, within our downtowns, water or septic, to be able to do more of that cluster development. Maybe some of the federal funding that's coming out through infrastructure will hopefully help that. And then to sort of like address what you're saying is to be mindful of then how do we address fragmentation and the increasing sort of rural sprawl that we're seeing, which happens because people do want to live out in forest in Vermont. And so we understand that. So the best I can say is that I think municipalities and the state are grappling as a whole with this, and we just need to keep on utilizing sort of the best practices we can in order to encourage both good affordable housing design, clustering, and then paying attention to the impacts in our more sensitive areas, in our forested areas in Vermont.
Yeah, I mean, I have literally had planning commissioners from other towns and people on the housing coalition say, it's about time for the animals to move over. And I just cringe.
I'm gonna bring in another question here. Thanks, Alice. This one's from Aaron Worthley. Did you assess how effectively regs are addressing wildlife, habitat fragmentation, etc.? It's one thing to include it in the regs, but if it's too strict or rigid or challenged and abandoned versus being too flexible or open to interpretation.
That's a great question, and I think the short answer is no. We didn't actually have metrics that then provided like a spectrum, let's say, of how strong or how weak they are. We wanted to capture how much they are addressing fragmentation. Aaron, I think your point is really good. And then there's another point is, and how well are the regulations actually implemented, which is not something that we can actually measure, but is a concern because there can be a lot of variables. The best, intended regulation may not be implemented very well. So what we do have, though, is we are creating case studies for Act 171 implementation, which is more the planning side of things. But I think we're trying to create sort of an overview of the best examples of fragmentation standards that we do see. And so the report will have examples for you. And then we continue like through our community strategies guide, the reprint there, provide a number of the better examples that we see. And so it's not to say that we're ignoring the importance of looking at it, but from a measurement perspective, I don't think the report did as much of that deep dive as maybe would be helpful. And that is a good note for us, I think, for the next round to maybe do a finer deep dive into the efficacy of the standards themselves. Although that would require maybe looking at then the efficacy of all the standards for a lot of different metrics. And all I can say is this project is a bear. It's a lot of data collection, and I think we're lucky to still be alive and here to present to you after the data collection effort.
Here's a question from Billy. Do you have examples of adequate bylaw language?
Yeah, so again, the report will have examples. It may not be as exhaustive as you'd like. We're trying to provide a good example for every page that we have a figure or a metric, and provide some case studies. And then, for those of you who are especially steeped in planning and you're actually looking, for good examples, then I just encourage you to reach out to Jens, to Andy, reach out to me, and we can kind of then steer you into, what we're seeing, because we are sort of compiling on the side the best examples, and then we can help you in that way.
I think we've got time for one final question here. This one's from a little bit earlier. Louise is wondering, where will we be able to see all this data as it pertains to our individual towns? So not just the aggregate data.
Yeah, so this question was presented in another presentation recently. So I think that we need to get together and understand how to be responsive to requests to share the data. I think that we would like to be able to share the data. We need to make sure that it's ready to be shared. I think we'd probably like to wait until the report is public. And then for those of you who would like to see the data at the townwide level, we can then, or a regional level, we can instruct you on how to use it. And I think we'll just need to come up with the parameters for doing that. So thanks for that interest. Please do follow up with us.
Any other questions folks have? We're happy to stay on another minute or two.
Susan, I see your question. When can we get copies of the presentation? We do have, we recorded this presentation. We have also done a previous session of this, and we recorded that as well. So we can share those YouTube videos with you. We put them up on our resources page, and we'll share that link with you. And we're also happy to share a PDF of as a handout. So all that is available to you. And with that, Dakota, I put that map up in the chat, but I will email it to you separately so you can see that. But we are at 2:01, and I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. It is so great to have you all with us. Jamie, thank you so much for your piece of this. Andy, thank you for working the back end of all of the webinar. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
And thank you all for
Good job.
putting
Thank you.
on the show.
Cheers.